It's a great pleasure to welcome Diana Mitchell to our talk today. As some of you will know, we have this idea that we celebrate anniversaries on our talks. And for example, it was the 200th anniversary of the decoding of the Rosetta Stone. So we had an Oxford professor talking about that. It's also the 100th anniversary of the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb by Lord Carnarvon, who lives in Highclere Castle. And Diana was for 20 plus years the head guide at Downton, where they've got a lot of... I got that wrong, didn't I? And so, where they also have some of the Egyptian artifacts as well at Highclere. So Diana is ideally well qualified to talk to us about the discovery of the tomb. Thank you, Diana.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Hamish, for those very kind words. And it's delightful to be at the Haslemere Festival. It's the second week, I think, now of it. But welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's lovely to see you. I hope you can all hear me. And likewise, people at home, I do hope you can hear me clearly and see what comes up clearly as well. So my talk is entitled One More Year, the Earl, the Castle and the Tomb. And as we go along, it'll unfold why I have chosen that title. I also have to thank my husband, who is obviously parking the car rather difficultly, because he's been gone for some time, because he did my slides for me. So if anything goes wrong, it is his fault and not mine. But anyway, Hamish has mentioned who I am. And I work at Highclere Castle and have been head guide for many, many years. I stood down last year as head guide, but I am still guiding. And still enjoy it. And whilst I enjoy it, I shall carry on guiding when it suits me, rather than nearly all the time. Now, over the years, Highclere has had several different guises, and as quite well known these days, is a place called Downton. I'm not going to really talk about Downton, but only just for a few minutes at the beginning, and then we can close that and get on with the subject in mind that we have today. So the last few weeks, we've had this gentleman here at the castle, and he seems to think it's his home. He seems to think it's in Yorkshire, and he seems to think he's called the Earl of Grantham. When he arrives, he brings about 150 people with him, and this is made up of camera people, directors, assistant directors, costume people, continuity people, carpenters, sound people, and it's rather busy. And it's, of course, Hugh Bonneville, who plays Lord Grantham in Downton Abbey. They are filming the second film there. You may have heard about it, but it's even more boring, I have to say, watching it than the previous ones. They seem to be even slower and have far more people than normal. I think the last film was such a success, they're now spending more money on this film. But let's forget that, because that's not what we're talking about today. But who actually lives at Highclere Castle today? It's the 8th Earl of Carnarvon, Geordie Geordie Carnarvon, and he inherited the house in 2001. And he and his wife now run it, and his wife, Fiona, is his second wife. She's very good at coming up with ideas. And because we are so popular now, we have an awful lot of visitors, and whatever she comes up with, it seems to sell, which is obviously very good for them and the castle. Now, he, as I mentioned, became the Earl in 2001 after the death of his father, Henry Herbert. And he was a lovely gentleman. And he died in 2001 on 9/11. Nothing to do with that, but it's a date one doesn't forget. But he opened the castle to the general public in 1988. His father died in 1987. But he was also the Queen's racing manager for over 30 years. And next to him, he's got his wife, Jeannie, and she died 2 years ago. And she's quite popular around the Newbury area because she started. We have a spring festival, as Hazelwood does, and she was instrumental in starting it 42 years ago. Unfortunately, ours has been delayed this year, and we're having it in middle 2 weeks in September. And hopefully, we're still waiting for details, but hopefully it's going to take place. Now, the 7th Earl, the late Earl, inherited the estate from his father, the 6th Earl, who was the last Earl to live at the house full time. And he died in 1987. He was Earl for over 50 years, so he saw a lot of changes in the house. When we moved to the area over 40 years ago, he was quite old and grumpy, but he was really quite nice when you got to know him. But the Earl we are interested in is the 5th Earl, the great-grandfather of the present Earl. And here he is on the right with Howard Carter, who both play a very important part in our story. So we've got the Earl, the castle's behind you, and we've got the tomb, which is what they're most famous for. Now, this was quite a long time that this took place over. So 1 more year, that's what I called the talk, and we'll find at the end why it was 1 more year. But over 3,000 years ago, a teenage boy died. Well, you know who it is, because that's why you're here today, because obviously it's Tutankhamun. And this is his gold mask, which is obviously known the world over now. It just amazes me to think the Egyptians were able to make such beautiful articles all those years ago, even though without electricity, without the electric tools or anything. It's absolutely beautiful. I'm always amazed whenever I think about it. But we're going to have a timeline, and you might wonder where the timeline's going as I go through it. But hold the faith, because we will get there in the end. Okay, and some things you might think are a little bit irrelevant, but they all kind of join together in the end. So an earldom is created 240 years ago about, and you can probably work out who that is, but we'll go into these things as we come to them later on. But I'm just going to give you the timeline now. And 220 years ago, a Corsican chap who was kind of full of himself, some people hated him, some didn't, appears on the scene. And he did do some quite good things, actually, especially in Egypt. Now let's move on quite a bit, 130 years ago, and a teenage artist is discovered in Norfolk. And you probably think, well, how can that have anything to do with the story? But quite an important part, as we'll see as we get further down there. And then a car crash happens in Germany. Well, that doesn't sound important or two, but in fact, you'll see how important the car crash is to this story. And then the experts say there is nothing more to find. But the nobleman doesn't give up, and he says, just 1 more year. So that's how we've got to the 1 more year. But how did that happen? So we're now going back about 240 years ago, and a few things happened about that time, and they did have a link. And the link was our Prime Minister, our present Prime Minister, goes to a certain school west of London in Berkshire, and these people that I'm going to talk about all went to that school. And probably know about the Boston Tea Party, which wasn't a tea party. The locals got fed up with this tax. Lord North, the Prime Minister, an old Etonian, had brought in and dumped the tea in the sea, in the harbour at Boston, rather than putting it on land. He wasn't pleased at all. Now, a few years later, a new race was started at Epsom, and you're not far from Epsom, and you probably know which race it was, because it was started by the 12th Earl of Derby, Lord Derby, and again, another old Etonian. And then in 1780, there was uprising on the London streets. And a member of Parliament, George Gordon, Lord Gordon, started this uprising. It was a religious uprising, and the military were called into the streets of London, and another old Etonian was asked to help quell it, and that was Henry Herbert. And George III ennobled him by making him Lord Porchester, Baron Porchester in 1780, and in 1793 he made him Lord Carnarvon. So that's how the link comes through to Lord Carnarvon. Sorry, excuse me. It was quite a long journey here. The car was playing up. That now took us a very peculiar route. I have never come before, and the traffic was bad. So I probably got thirsty over the time. So this is the first Earl of Carnarvon, and we're now on the 8th Earl of Carnarvon, but the most important one is the 5th, and we will get to him. Now, about 20 years later, this Corsican chap arrives in Egypt, and you can probably work out who this is, perhaps not by the photograph, but by this photograph here, and it's Napoleon. And in fact, the photograph on the left, it's not a photograph because there was photography around then, and we don't even know if he went to the Sphinx, but it's a collage. Now, Napoleon invaded Egypt, and he had turned up there with about 150 scholars and artists. So they record what they found there. But unfortunately, he didn't last long, because along came this admiral, Lord Nelson, and obviously scuttled the boats, and they all had to flee. And it meant Napoleon and his army were kind of stranded in Egypt and had to leave because they couldn't get their food and anything towards them. So that was very unfortunate for him, but fortunate to us. And we're going to speak, there's a couple of things that links Napoleon with us. Now, this desk here is at Highclere Castle in the music room, and it was Napoleon's desk when he was in exile. I mean, he was imprisoned twice in his life, once in Elba, but he managed to escape. But then later on, after Waterloo, he was sent to St Helena by the British, where he spent the rest of his life. And this desk was his when he was in St Helena. The desk was his from Fontainebleau, made by a French cabinet maker, Jacques Prieur, and they're meant to be very, very valuable. Now, the reason we have Napoleon, a desk of Napoleon's, I'm sure he had an awful lot of desks in Highclere, is because after his death, his artifacts, his belongings were sold off, and the family bought it as an interesting piece of furniture. Has anyone been to Highclere Castle by any chance? Oh, not one person. Well, you would have gone through to the you would have gone through to the music room, and it's a gorgeous room because it's facing south and east. And on the wall, just to the side of the desk, you've got these wonderful silk wall hangings. They're not tapestries, they're silks, and they're 16th century. Absolutely lovely to see. But let's get back to Napoleon. Well, he actually started something that's still going strong today, a different name, I think, the Institute of Egypt. But this is what brought Egypt to the world in a way, because people then started getting interested in it. And the following year, now if you were at the talk last week on the Rosetta Stone, I expect you know all about that, far more than I do, but that was a great, great find, because the scholars could then work out what the hieroglyphics meant, and it opened a whole new world about things that were happening in Egypt and around that area. But also, because he had taken these scholars with him and artists, a book was published in France, Travels of Lower and Upper Egypt. So this actually then brought it to all the English speakers, and people really started going to Egypt, especially obviously wealthy people to travel, but excavate as well. But this was translated into English quite quickly. And here we've got the English copy, and you can see the wonderful pictures in here. Well, let's move on a little bit now, and we come to 130 years ago when a young artist is discovered in Norfolk. Well, this is Howard Carter. Howard Carter was born in London. His father was an artist, but he was quite a sickly boy. So in fact, he was sent to Norfolk to live with his aunt and uncle. And he seemed to be a skilled artist like his father. And Mary Cecil, Lady Amherst, who lived in Didlington Hall in Norfolk, had quite a lot of Egyptian artifacts and other articles that her father, who was a great explorer, excavator, had bought, and she'd been left them, and she wanted to have some sketches of them. And so she asked Howard Carter to come and sketch them. And this was a really wonderful thing for him, because this is something he loved doing, but also this is where his love of Egypt started. And she then, in those days, there was an institute, an Egyptian excavation fund in the UK, and she was able to arrange for him to go out to Egypt. And that's where he spent an awful lot of his life after that. So we know Howard Carter went to Egypt in 1891. So that's how he's got there. Okay, but he was a wonderful artist. This is not from one of his sketches he did for Lady Amherst, but this is later on. And you can see the detail of it. It looks like a photograph. It's so wonderful. I'm not artistic at all, so I'm always amazed by these things. So the colors are lovely. But we're now going to move on to 20 years later. The Earl, this is Lord Carnarvon, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. And this drawing, which we have in our saloon, the centre of the house in the castle, was actually drawn by Howard Carter's brother William. So it's quite an artistic family. Anyway, he's digging in Egypt, and he finally gets the concession of the tomb of Tutankhamun, because he's told there is nothing there. The gentleman who had that concession, Theodore Davis, an American, had been digging for many, many years. He'd found quite a few bits and pieces and of Tutankhamun, and thought that was that. And he gave it up. Great excitement for the 5th Earl, but unfortunately he couldn't start digging because there was an interruption. Because it was 1914 and the First World War came. So no digging for 4 years, well, 5 years actually. So afterwards they got digging again, and then in 1922, finally the find. And this is Lord Carnarvon on the right, Howard Carter on the left. They've taken the wall down to the entrance of the exhibition. So we're going to find how they got there, and how Lord Carnarvon went to Egypt as well. But just a few little exhibitions you might have seen, Egyptian exhibitions. Now this is back at Highclere Castle on the south side, looking over the meadow, wildflower meadow to the house. And we have an Egyptian exhibition at Highclere Castle. The Earl had nothing from the tomb at all. He wasn't allowed to keep anything because this was a complete tomb. I mean, and when you found anything in Egypt, you paid for an area to dig in, a concession. The Egyptian government gave you a concession. And if you found anything, you were allowed to keep a small part, and they kept the rest. But when he found the tomb of Tutankhamun, he wasn't allowed to keep anything because it was a complete tomb. So that has always been in Egypt, in Cairo, apart from the few times it's gone abroad on visits. But it is very good. We do have copies of the Tutankhamun in the exhibition at Highclere, and they are brilliant, having seen some of the real things. But I'm not an expert, I can't see the difference between them. But I don't know if any of you in 2019, 2020 went to London to the Saatchi Gallery, because there was a Tutankhamun exhibition there. It was going around certain cities in the world for 6 months at each place. And there were 150 articles, and they were beautifully shown. It really was wonderful. I was due to go to for my 3rd time with a couple of my grandchildren, but unfortunately it closed on the 21st of March, the time we were due to go, just as lockdown was coming in. A great disappointment for the children. But it's an interesting building as well, because the Duke of York's headquarters. And the Duke of York, if you go to London quite a lot and go along Pall Mall, you go down the Duke of York steps and his statue as you go into St James's Park. But the other side of the square is this wonderful, I don't know if you've been there, but it's a most wonderful grocer's shop, Partridge's, and deli, and a little cafe. And I tell you, the pastries, well, I'm rather, pastry person, I'm afraid, but they're absolutely lovely. It's a super place to go to. But on the other hand, there's so many lovely places around that part of London, and of course, quite a well-known department store as well. But if you're interested in Egyptology, you may have been to the Cairo Museum. And here we are here. It's an interesting place. My husband and I went about 4 years ago, and it's absolutely heaving with artifacts. And I believe they've only ever shown half the Egyptian artifacts, Tutankhamun artifacts, because there's just so many. There were nearly 6,000 objects. But they have been moving some of the artifacts from that museum. They have been building 2 new museums. And you've got the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization, which is about 4 miles away from Cairo. And they moved all the royal mummies, just a few months ago, a great ceremony. The army were out there, and we can see them here. And here they are just moving 4 miles away. And they finally come to the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization. Now, this is part opened, I believe. But also, after the last few years, they've been moving the Tutankhamun artifacts to a new museum. And that's taken quite a time to move. And the articles that were in London at the beginning of lockdown are now in the new museum, which is not open yet. It's called the Grand Museum. It's about out by the pyramids, and it does look quite grand. But it was meant to open about 4 years ago. Last year it was meant to open, but lockdown came. This year, hopefully next year. I've told Horace, my husband, that we're going to go back again, but not till it opens. Because in the old museum, things weren't particularly well laid out. If you've been there, they weren't particularly laid out well. The heating wasn't quite right. They were deteriorating. And it was really quite sad. It was still incredibly exciting, but it was quite sad when you saw some of the smaller pieces and objects. Now, if you've been to Cairo, you will, of course, visited the Valley of the Kings. Very different today than it was 100 years ago when Lord Carnarvon and Howard Carter were there. Very busy. A lot of the tours go around early in the morning because it gets so hot. And they now actually are quite civilized because they do have a loo there and a shelter, as you can see on the left there, and even little market stalls as well, so you can spend your money there. Now, we went about 3 or 4 years ago, and we'd flown down from Cairo to Luxor in the morning. We were going in the afternoon to the Valley of the Kings. Fortunately, it was early in the year, so it wasn't too hot. But I was under the weather, not like me. So when I asked our guide, as we were going out on the coast, we were only in a group of about a dozen, would we be going to Howard Carter's house? And he said, no, it wasn't on the itinerary. And because I was under the weather and could know where I could go down to, he kindly sent Horace and myself and the driver to Howard Carter's house, whilst the rest of the group went round the tombs, and then the driver went back to collect them. And we were very, very lucky. And the reason I'm really interested in, because this was built, well, not personally built, but paid for by the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. And they say it's a mud hut, but in fact, it was built out of bricks from Brackby, which was one of Lord Carnarvon's houses that he had in Derbyshire. It's now, I think, very expensive flats. I think it's been an old folks' home. He sold it soon after this because the cost of excavation in Egypt runs very, very high, and he was running out of money. But we went round with the custodian. There was only Horace, myself, and the custodian. And the custodian insisted on taking our photographs. I mean, we wanted to take them ourselves. And this funny person behind the desk is me, sitting behind Howard Carter's desk. And it was wonderful because I lounged on Lord Carnarvon's lounger that he'd lounged on. I put his hat, it was still on the hat stand. I mean, it felt such a privilege. And as you can see, it's such a lovely little English garden as well. I think it did get in bad condition at one stage, as Lord Carnarvon said, what was it like? He'd been several times, but not recently. And I said, well, it's been done up. All I can say, it was incredibly dusty. And the custodian, instead of sitting on his backside, should have been perhaps dusting it, but still, it was wonderful, and we were very, very lucky to go. But back to our story, the Earl, the castle, and the tomb. Now, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, he made a very good marriage, money-wise. He was 29, quite an extravagant young man, I have to say, and he found Almina Womwell, this very pretty lady who was 19, and decided he was going to marry her. And it was said that she was the illegitimate daughter of Alfred the Rothschild. Now, the Rothschilds are a pretty wealthy family, and they have quite a few homes in Buckinghamshire, or did. Now they're owned by several of them by the National Trust. And this is Horton House, which he had built in 3 years, remarkably. And I think he was trying to race his cousin down the road. Was it Lionel Waddesdon? No, it wasn't Lionel. I can't remember which one it was. But the chap who built Waddesdon, which obviously is much grander than this. And that went on for years and years building it. It's a National Trust place now. But if you ever were invited to, Alfred remained a bachelor all his life. And it's quite interesting about Almina. It was never proved or disproved that she was his daughter, but he was incredibly generous to her. But if you ever had a weekend down at Horton House, when you got back in your car or your carriage, you would find boxes of orchids, cigars, sweeties, flowers, all sorts of wonderful things. And this house, when he had it built, it had electricity. So one of the earliest houses to have electricity. It had a lift, and it even had an indoor pool. So very advanced. It's now owned by the RAF Horton, as the officers' mess there. I keep trying to organise for the guides to go there out of interest, but haven't managed to succeed yet, but perhaps next year, not this year, but next year. But when the Earl decided to marry Almina, he went to the Rothschilds to negotiate a dowry. And contracts were drawn up, and he was very, very generous. The money was put into trust, and they drew down so much a year, and it meant that if he died before it was all paid, it would keep coming. And as you can see, it was £500,000, which they tell me is over 60 million in today's money. Well, they got through it quite quickly. Now, this young man, 29-year-old, was already in debt, and his debts were a mere £150,000. We'll talk about a misspent youth, but the Rothschild paid them off. And if Almina wanted another 10 or 20,000, it was forthcoming. So he obviously was very fond of her. But this enabled the Earl to indulge in his hobbies. And none of them were cheap hobbies. He loved racehorses, photography and motoring, among other things, but these were the main ones, which took up an awful lot of money. But he founded the stud in 1902. We have a horse racing stud on the estate. It's still going strong today. And it was as I mentioned earlier on, the late Earl, the present Earl's father, was the Queen's racing manager for over 30 years. And now his son-in-law, John Warren, is her bloodstock agent. He's a bloodstock agent, and John married Lord Carnarvon's, the late Earl's daughter, Caroline Warren. And what is extraordinary is the Highclere Stud, as it's called now, when it was founded by the 5th Earl, was called Sidown. That's the hill. Just got Beacon Hill here, Sidown Hill, and the stud in the middle. Sidown Warren Stud. And now the Warrens own it. Just coincidence, but really quite amazing coincidence. But if you're ever at the races, you'll nearly always see, if Her Majesty's at the races, you'll nearly always see John by her side. And here is John, the mother. Her Majesty is not looking very happy. Yeah. Here she's just looking, well, what's that? And he doesn't seem to understand. But here is a much happier photograph of her, whether it's a joke or the horse had won. And the lady behind John is Caroline, his wife, and they live on the estate in Milford Lake House, and lovely family. And their elder son, Jakey, is now very involved with the stud and obviously going to take it over. Now, as I said, you saw that he was very keen on photography. Well, don't forget, 100 years ago, photography was really quite new. And he obviously had the latest equipment. He had a dark room made at the castle, and even in Howard Carter's house in Egypt, when he started working with Howard Carter, there was a dark room in that house so they could develop the pictures very quickly. But this is, you can see how good they are when you see this head study here of this young lady. It's absolutely beautiful. I mean, it could have been taken just the other day. But he was also interested in cars. Now, this is not one of his cars, it's just a photograph of an old car. We couldn't find any photographs of it. Well, there's a few in the archives, but I can't get into the archives at present. It was Lady Seagrave, they were getting there at present, and our archivist hasn't come back since lockdown. But he had a lot of cars over the years, French, German, American, British, and he was rather a fast driver. And up to 1896, there was an act that was repealed, the Red Flag Act. Before then, you drove along the road and there'd be someone walking in front of you with a red flag to warn everyone this funny machine called a car was coming. But after that, it was repealed, so people could go 10 or 12 miles an hour. Well, not fast enough for the fifth hour. In the archives at the castle, we have so many speeding tickets. He had a good lawyer because he got off quite a few times. But often he would be driving along in his car and he'd have the chauffeur behind in case he had an accident or ran out of petrol or the car broke down. Well, in 1901, he was driving in Germany to meet his wife Almina somewhere. The chauffeur was with him. They only had the one car. He was driving because he much preferred driving, but he took the chauffeur as a kind of backup, I suppose. And unfortunately, he kind of just going along the road, comes up to the top of a brow hill, and suddenly just in front of him, coming up the hill, is some heavy carts and things, and he has to swerve to avoid them, and unfortunately, an accident happened. These are not his, they're just ones we found. And the chopman, the chauffeur was thrown clear, but Lord Carnarvon wasn't. The car landed on him and the chauffeur got him out. He wasn't a well person even before this, but after that, he was very sickly and walked with a walking stick for the rest of his life. And he was only 35 when this happened. But as he began to recover, his doctors suggested he went somewhere warm and for his health and drive for his health. And he knew Egypt very well. He'd been there in 1898 and he'd taken his wife Almina there as well, and he liked it and the climate was just right for him. So he started going to Egypt. So let's look at our timeline again, and so we can see eventually how these two meet. So as we know, Carter went through Lady Amherst in 1891. He got a few jobs in Lower and Upper Egypt, but unfortunately, he ended up freelancing in 1907. Now, he did a lot of drawing around this temple here. This is Hatshepsut temple, and he got a lot of work down there. But unfortunately, in 1905, there was some rowdy French tourists. They were drunk, and they'd gone to the rest house, the Antiquity Red Rest House, and were being very difficult. And oh, have I not been pressing the button? Sorry about that, folk. Thank you very much. Sorry. So
now you need to go back.
Oh, absolutely. I was only 1 or 2 short. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. But these rowdy French tourists who were drunk then decided they wanted to go into the tombs. The ticket inspectors made them pay. Half of them didn't pay. They didn't want to pay. Then when they got into the tombs, they wanted candles. They weren't allowed candles, of course. Then they wanted their money back. They then barricaded themselves into the rest house. So Carter was asked to come along and try and sort it out. Well, Carter was quite a difficult person, didn't often get on with people, and very set in his ways. And so he asked them to leave. Well, they didn't wish to leave. He probably didn't ask them in perhaps the most tactful way either. But they didn't want to leave, and so they started damaging the rest house. And unfortunately, the guards that were trying to get them out, they actually attacked some of them. It wasn't a happy state. Well, of course, the French and the English opinions of this were totally different. And this, unfortunately, led to Howard Carter having to resign his job. And so after that, he did some freelancing, but not had a full-time job. Now, Lord Carnarvon arrived after the car crash in 1903, a couple of years after this bad accident, as he began to recover. And after a couple of years of going out, he decided he needed to do something. And he was really getting quite keen on the idea of excavation. So in 1905, he applied to the Egyptian government and was given his first concession in Thebes. Not an exciting place to dig. He'd paid his money, and at the end of about 6 weeks digging, it was great excitement because he did find something. He found a coffin, but it was a cat's coffin. So exciting. Cats were very important, but obviously not as exciting after all the money that had been spent on him. But he did start going back and did a bit more digging, but he wasn't getting very good concessions. And his friends said, well, why don't you get an expert to help you? You might be able to get better concessions then. And he must have met Howard Carter somewhere or other, at a drink store or something, whatever they did out there. As he was free, he decided to employ him. So he employed him from 1909. And they did get slightly better concessions. So they did find quite a few things. He obviously gave a percentage to the Egyptian government, but he was allowed to keep some, and they came back to Highclere. Now, we don't have all those at Highclere now, because after his death, his widow sold the majority off to the Metropolitan Museum in New York. I think they offered more than the British Museum. So that's why they're there. But in 2014, finally, he got what he wanted, the Valley of the Kings. But as we learned earlier on, unfortunately, no digging because the outbreak of the First World War. And we can see how different Egypt was in those days, the Valley of the Kings, than it is now. So finally, 4 years later, the end of the war is announced, so they can get digging. Well, they didn't start digging until 2019. Obviously, they were discussing this during the summer of 2019, what they would do and where they would start. And once 1919 came, cooler weather, Carter's out there digging. But it was very, very sad, only bits and pieces. After all this excitement that we were going to find something, but no. And the following year, this was really getting quite a disaster. And the following year. And of course, the war had made an effect on people, their finances and things. And also in 1918, Alfred de Rothschild had died. So that kind of dried up. He'd been very generous with his will, I have to say. He did leave Almina £50,000 and the fifth Earl 25,000, and Almina, his house in London, in Seymour Place, and most of the contents in it. They were incredibly extravagant people. So anyway, Carter used to stay often with Lord Carnarvon when he was in England in the summer. And so he's staying with him for a weekend house party. They had gone to the races in Newbury in the afternoon, and then they were discussing what was going to happen that coming winter. And Lord Carnarvon had to tell Howard Carter, I'm sorry, that's it. I cannot afford it anymore. I'm broke. Well, obviously there's broke, but obviously he was broke. And obviously a great argument took place, and in the end, Carter said, well, look, I'll put something towards it. Well, Carter didn't have very much money. So in the end, the Earl gave in, and so you get to just one more year. Great excitement. Carter went out at end of Egypt. They started digging. Lord Carnarvon was still back in England, and the 4th of November, they found the step. So obviously Carter got the rest of his group over, and they started to see if there were any more steps. And they found a whole flight of steps with a sealed entrance at the bottom. So Carter immediately uncovers the steps and sends a telegram to Lord Carnarvon. This is obviously, in the olden days, you didn't have phones, you could just call. If you tried to book a call, you had to wait probably a week or two before you get through. So the telegram was the quickest way of contacting someone. So you can imagine Lord Carnarvon, when the telegram arrived at Highclere Castle, the excitement he must have felt. Absolutely wonderful. Well, obviously, he rushed out there as quickly as possible. But in those days, it wasn't that quick, because it was over 2 weeks. But he finally got there. Howard Carter went down to Cairo to collect him. And then obviously a train back to London, to Luxor, and then out to the Valley of the Kings. And so they were finally ready to open the tomb on the 26th of November. Now, they had to, after the Howard Carter had cleared these steps, he'd sent the telegram to Lord Carnarvon, but he then had to, he filled the steps again with rubble because he didn't want anyone going in. So they had to clear it again. There was an entrance they managed to get through, and then there was a 30-foot corridor full of rubble as well. So they cleared that, and finally they got to the door of a sealed tomb, hopefully. Honestly, they had no idea. Anyway, they started breaking the wall down. There was just enough space so Howard Carter could go through with his candle. And all was silent. Lord Carnarvon's waiting outside, his daughter's there. There's one of the people from the Egyptian place, society, and nothing. And after a while, Lord Carnarvon says, "Can you see anything?" Well, Carter obviously was speechless because it was just so wonderful, just wonderful things, gold everywhere. And this is some of his reflections after he got out and was saying what he thought when he first found it. So you can see they are strange country artifacts. If you've been to the museum or seen anything, they're most peculiar. So obviously they had to get electricity wired up because they couldn't see the room properly. They didn't know what else was there. And so within the next couple of days, they got the electricity wired up, and also a guard was placed, or a couple of guards, at the entrance, because obviously a hint of finding anything, they're all in wanting robbers and things like that. So the electricity is wired up, and as their eyes went down the room, they noticed at the far end, 2 sentries, guardians, obviously guarding. You can see a change in the wall there. And so, even more exciting, there was another room, So the papers obviously very excited about all this, but it did take them nearly 3 months to clear that first room, because Howard Carter photographed, everything was numbered, it was photographed in situ, and then it was taken to another tomb, which obviously had been wired up with electricity, so they could work on the article and repair it or clean it or whatever, and then it was sent up to the Cairo Museum. And after a couple of months, I mean, they hadn't done all of that, but they cleared the first tomb. A couple of weeks after they opened the tomb, Lord Carnarvon came back to spend Christmas back in Highclere and then returned back to Egypt again. And by the middle of February, they were ready to open up this other room. So they were breaking down the wall, and there was a sealed shrine in there. I think Carter got quicker and quicker. Come on, let's see what there is. And finally, they got the entrance down, and there was this wonderful big gold box to greet them. It was about a couple of feet lower than the antechamber they were in. And so they kind of dropped down and walked round it. They could just about get round the outside. The walls had hieroglyphics on them, and off on one side, there was another chamber, which they called the treasury. So when they came out, I mean, you can imagine they were totally speechless. Absolutely wonderful, yet more wonderful artifacts. So they decided to have a break. Howard Carter's team had been working all through the hot weather, cold weather, but hot out there through the winter. And they decided to have a break. And also Howard Carter had to work out how to get this enormous box out. And would they find anything else? But then disaster happened to Lord Carnarvon because he died. So obviously the papers were full of this, and all sorts of rumours started going around. It was said just after they opened the first room, one of the helpers of Howard Carter had sent him back to his house to get something. And when he went in, there was a cry, and the helper saw a cobra gobbling up Howard Carter's pet canary. And so people were beginning to kind of put things together and think there must be a curse here. Well, Lord Carnarvon wasn't a well person. He got a bite on his left cheek, probably a mosquito bite. He unfortunately caught it shaving, septicemia set in, and he succumbed to pneumonia. And this is before penicillin was around as we know it today. But obviously all these things started, but also they say all the lights went out in Cairo. Well, this is 1923, electricity was new, they were going out all the time. And they also said his beloved dog Susie howled and dropped dead at the same time. Well, according to his son, Susie did die, but about a week later. It's amazing how things grow up. But obviously the media, again, were even more about this and the curse, and they shouldn't be doing anything. But as I said, digging had stopped anyway, because they were trying to work out how they were going to get this wonderful gold box out. And Almina rushed out just before the Earl died, and she said to Howard Carter, yes, I will finance this. So Howard Carter could start digging again. So he can continue digging, and you can see here it took him 10 years to excavate, to write all about it and get it all sent up to Cairo. It's always been in the Cairo Museum. No one's been allowed anything apart from, obviously, I don't know if any of you went to the, if you were old enough to go to the 1972 exhibition at the British Museum, which was the most popular exhibition the British Museum had ever run still to this day. It was so popular. People were queuing around at night and everything. But I thought you'd like to see the kind of how the tomb was, what it was like. It was quite a small tomb for a pharaoh. Only one room had paintings and hieroglyphs on, which was the burial chamber. But you see, they thought there was two rooms. Then they found the treasury, and then after they'd cleared all that, they found another room, the annex at the end. And here's another picture of it. And altogether, there were nearly 6,000 articles. Now, if you've been to the Cairo Museum, then you may have seen these wonderful shrines. This is what they saw when they went into the burial chamber to begin with. And there's four of them getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And then there was Howard Carter's, then there were the coffins, 3 coffins getting smaller and smaller and smaller, then the gold mask, and then Lord Carnarvon himself, Howard Carter himself. So you can see all the wonderful effort and everything. But what was interesting about these boxes, when we were there a few years back, we were standing in front of the largest one, and because of the reflection, we could see the next one down in it. It looks as if it was actually in it, but it was just a reflection. It was absolutely wonderful. And then this lovely Howard Carter, Lord Carnarvon, sorry, Tutankhamun. I haven't given a talk for so long. I do apologise because we've had lockdown, you see, and they were all cancelled last year. But Tutankhamun, and here he is, on what Horace always said to Lord Carnarvon is the first surfboard. well, I don't know, but he's got his harpoon there ready, obviously, to go for a fish. And at the also they found these wonderful, box here which had the canopic jars in, and you can see a goddess with the arms spread out, and there was one each side, and that's where the canopic jars were. And also one of the paintings in the middle here, in the burial chamber, where you can understand where wonderful things came from, just wonderful things. So as I said, it took 10 years for Carter to complete the work, and he died back in England, in London, in 1939. And he is buried at Putney Cemetery, which is just off the A3, southwest of London. And on his tomb is written these words. And they came from one of the vessels he found, this wonderful alabaster vessel. And we have got a copy of that at the castle. Absolutely gorgeous, but that's written on there. But as I mentioned before, Lord Carnarvon died in 1905. His name at Barn McCluddy was brought back to England and buried at the top of Beacon Hill. If you've been up the A34 or down it between Winchester and Newbury, you will have passed Beacon Hill. He wanted to be there all on his own, which he is, but his dog Susie is buried up there with him. And people say he's standing upright, but he's not. He is buried properly. And it's a wonderful place. And he's buried up there to look down on his stud, which you can just see to the west of there, just behind. That's his racing stud. And also on his beloved castle. Now, I'm not a photographer, but I took that photograph quite a few years ago, about 6:30 in the morning. And it really came out well. And you can see what a wonderful view that he's got. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to me. I hope you enjoyed it.
Do we have any questions? Yes.
How is it that that particular tomb escaped looting and robbery?
Well,
so many tombs have been.
Yes. I'm not sure why, but it was a very small tomb, and I think because they were digging, the sand was moving all the time, and they just uncovered it. And perhaps Carter was really clever. I mean, he mapped out everything, where they were digging, and then where they were going to do next once they got to the Valley of the Kings. So nothing was left. You know, you weren't covering somewhere with sand and then missing it out. But it is amazing because Theodore Davis, this American, was there for many years digging and didn't find it with all his helpers. A bit of luck as well, just in time. But I don't actually really know, not being an Egyptologist, but that's all I can think about because the sand shifts with the wind as well. And just, you've been lucky, was lucky in the end.
I think people tend to forget it had been there with nobody doing anything to it for 3,000 years because they moved away from the Valley of the Kings. And so for 3,000 years, that was left to nature. And nature hid it all.
Yes.
So
yes.
all the tombs had to be discovered because they were all hidden by nature, as well as the fact that when they decided to leave the valley, they concealed it deliberately. And then nature. Oh
yes, they were all concealed immediately because otherwise the robbers would get it. And they do think it was robbed soon after it was done, they feel, because they found couple of little holes which someone may have got in, but they don't know if anything was taken because there wasn't an inventory. There wasn't anything to tell them about anything that was meant to be there. Because after, in ancient Egypt, after someone died, they had 70 days to get them ready for the funeral, because obviously they mummified the body, which took 40 days to dry out, and they did everything. And then they've got them in, and then obviously they've got to fill the tomb with all these wonderful treasures, because for the afterlife. And that's why they took everything with them, because they wanted to be comfortable in their afterlife. And they would do this as quickly as possible, and then obviously seal it up and try and hide it so the robbers wouldn't find it.
I recollect that there are all these kingdoms historically. Was this the Middle Kingdom that came from?
This were, oh my gosh, it was the 18th. I think that was the middle, but it was 18th in that kind of area. And I'm sorry, I'm not an Egyptologist, so I mean, I have to go back to the exhibition and look at it, because I think in that particular period, he was about 18, and then only went a couple more before it then changed, and the whole of Egypt then changed. But sorry about Hamish. Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon.
Why do you think Howard Carter's never been given an honour for his work?
Well,
Can you repeat the question?
oh yes, why was Howard Carter never given an honour?
Why was he never given an honour? British honour
No,
anyway.
it's just for the Zoom audience.
Oh, sorry.
Yes. The question I've just been asked was, why was he never given an honour, Howard Carter, after finding that? Well, it is very, very sad, I think, for both Lord Carnarvon, the 5th Earl, and Howard Carter, that they didn't make much about it, and it was really rather forgotten. And I'm not quite sure whether because he was such a difficult person, and probably even more difficult as he was excavating the tomb. I don't know, but when you go out there, when we went there, they talk about him a lot now, but not Lord Carnarvon. And yet Lord Carnarvon was very popular in his day. They used to call him Lordy, it seems. But they don't talk about him at all, but they talk about Howard Carter a lot. But it is very sad because he was just forgotten. And at his funeral in 1939, I think there was about 5 people. I mean, he never married, which is incredibly sad. And I expect they'll make a great big thing of it next year for the 100th anniversary. But hopefully he will be mentioned and not forgotten in that, but time will tell us that.
It's my pleasure to thank Diana so much for such an interesting talk. I mean, it was quite magical, and to get the whole history and how all these different events linked together and brought Lord Carnarvon to Egypt and with Carter. Diana, it was an excellent talk, and we'd like to thank you so much. Also, Horace for doing the technology. But but thank you very much from all of us.